They say the most dangerous kind of silence isn't the one you actually hear, it's the one that echoes back after you finally stop caring. The moment you genuinely stop caring, when the emotional tides that once pulled you helplessly toward the avoidant person finally start to calm down, something profound begins to shift. The balance that once defined your entire connection starts to change shape entirely. For a long stretch of time, the avoidant person found real comfort in knowing your attention consistently revolved around them. Your presence, even when it came wrapped in your own pain, quietly affirmed their sense of control. It wasn't that they consciously set out to hurt you. It's that your emotional investment became a kind of invisible safety net that protected them from having to face their own fears. The moment you begin withdrawing that energy, when you stop reacting, stop chasing, stop feeding the dynamic that once sustained the relationship, the avoidant person feels a sudden collapse happening somewhere deep within their own internal structure. That collapse was never really about losing you specifically. It's about losing the emotional architecture that kept their entire world feeling predictable and safe. Avoidant people crave distance, and yet they build their whole identity around the quiet assurance that someone is still waiting somewhere at the edges of that distance. When that waiting finally stops, their inner system panics. They experience a genuinely disorienting kind of loss, not because love itself has disappeared, but because control has slipped away from them. Emotional control functions as their silent language, really the only way they know how to feel secure without ever being fully exposed. So when you detach from the dynamic, it's almost as if you've rewritten the entire rulebook of their reality. The pattern they relied on suddenly stops making any sense to them. They once believed your care was essentially endless, that your hope was unbreakable, that your patience served as proof of their own worth. When that stops, it feels to them like their reflection in your emotional mirror has shattered into pieces. They begin quietly wondering what actually remains of them once no one is holding up that mirror anymore. This is exactly when their final subtle trick tends to begin. The avoidant person will often try to reclaim that lost sense of balance, not through genuine love or real connection, but through a kind of emotional reversal instead. They flip the emotional polarity that once kept them feeling safe. Suddenly, the person who once pulled away starts showing traces of renewed interest. The person who seemed permanently unreachable might start reappearing, perhaps sending a message that feels like closure on the surface, but is actually designed to reopen the wound underneath. It isn't genuine affection driving this behavior. It's a need to restore the old familiar order between you. They simply cannot tolerate being the one who feels unseen or forgotten. They need confirmation that they still hold some emotional gravity in your life. By testing whether you'll still respond to them, they're essentially measuring whether they still matter to you at all. They might act completely indifferent on the surface, while subtly working to draw your attention back toward them underneath. They might mention old memories designed to stir up your emotions, or hint vaguely at regret without ever actually offering you real healing or resolution. This is the central paradox running through their entire behavior. When you genuinely cared about them, they pulled away from you. Now that you've stopped caring, they move closer, but not to actually connect with you in any meaningful way, rather just to make sure they haven't been forgotten entirely. Their need for emotional validation operates well beneath their own conscious awareness. They don't sit down and consciously decide to manipulate you. Instead, their actions get driven by an underlying fear of losing the psychological safety your caring once reliably provided them. They don't understand that genuine safety actually lies in vulnerability rather than control. And so they cling tightly to what they already know: power gained through distance, security built on emotional imbalance. This final act can be genuinely the most confusing part for you to witness. You might start wondering if they've truly changed, if they now feel something they simply couldn't access before. But what's actually happening underneath the surface is a reflexive attempt to restore familiarity to a situation that no longer fits the old pattern. The dynamic between you was always a kind of dance, pursuit followed by withdrawal, giving followed by withholding. And the moment you step outside that dance entirely, the avoidant person feels genuinely unanchored. The silence they once used as a protective shield now feels to them like outright abandonment. They reach back toward you, not out of love, but simply to regain some sense of control over something their mind cannot otherwise reconcile, the loss of power within a relationship where power once defined their entire sense of safety. So when you stop caring, when you choose your own peace over ongoing chaos, the avoidant person's sense of control genuinely begins to crumble beneath them. They'll use emotional reversal specifically as a way to test whether they still hold a place somewhere inside your psyche. This was never really about rekindling the relationship itself. It's about re-establishing the familiar dynamic that once kept them feeling emotionally protected. They don't fully realize that this very need for control is exactly what fractured the connection in the first place. When the avoidant person senses that your energy has genuinely shifted, that the air between you two no longer carries the same electric charge it once did, something quietly stirs within them. For a long time, they've hidden safely behind walls of detachment, projecting an outward confidence in their own solitude. Yet the moment you finally stop reaching for them, stop chasing, stop hoping, they begin to feel an unfamiliar kind of ache setting in. This isn't love in the way you might wish it were. It's fear wearing the disguise of longing. The avoidant person's final trick often shows up as a sudden, unexpected softness, a display of vulnerability so surprising it genuinely catches you off guard. They might reach out with words that sound completely sincere, gestures that hint at real regret, or memories that tug directly at your heart. It feels, in the moment, as though they've finally recognized your worth, as if their cold mask has finally melted away for good. But underneath that apparent warmth lies something far more complicated and far less romantic than it appears. It's a defense mechanism born entirely out of panic. When you withdraw your care from them, you remove the mirror that once reflected their own image back to them. Avoidant individuals often struggle with an inner emptiness they genuinely cannot name or identify. Your love, even when they outright rejected it at the time, served as proof that they existed meaningfully within someone else's emotional world. Your attention confirmed their sense of value. Your persistence shielded them from having to confront their deeper fear of being fundamentally unworthy. So when you finally go silent, their subconscious mind trembles in response. They begin quietly wondering what actually remains of them without your reflection to lean on. This is exactly where the illusion of vulnerability begins to take shape. It isn't necessarily a deliberate, intentional deception on their part. It's more of an instinctual reaction to a kind of emotional starvation setting in. They sense that the bond which once quietly validated them is now dissolving in real time, and so they return to you cloaked in apparent vulnerability, not to genuinely heal anything between you, but simply to refill an inner void that's opened up. You might notice how their words suddenly sound completely different than before. They might talk about missing you, about finally realizing things they simply couldn't see clearly in the past. They may even openly admit to feeling fear, loneliness, or confusion. These moments can feel genuinely profound because they break sharply from the pattern of emotional distance that defined your entire connection up to that point. But the real tragedy here is that their vulnerability tends to end right around the point where genuine comfort would need to begin. Once they sense your heart opening back up again, once they feel the reassurance of being emotionally seen once more, the fear that drove their apparent softness starts fading away, and their old familiar defenses quietly return to their original place. This is a cycle born from survival instincts, not from any real cruelty on their part. Their sudden openness isn't actually a genuine revelation about themselves. It's simply a reflex designed to avoid the pain of feeling invisible. This is exactly why their timing tends to feel so cruel to the person on the receiving end. You waited so long to finally be understood, to be met halfway, to witness real emotional honesty from them. And right when you finally let go of that hope, they show up appearing completely transformed. It creates genuine confusion, a disorienting blend of renewed hope and simultaneous disbelief. You start questioning whether they've truly changed or whether your own detachment was actually the key ingredient all along. But what's genuinely happening beneath the surface is an internal conflict playing out between their need for connection and their deep fear of it. When they feel your absence acutely, the fear of abandonment temporarily overrides their fear of genuine intimacy. It pushes them back toward you, compelling them to reveal pieces of themselves they usually keep carefully buried away. But once the connection feels re-established again, their deeper underlying fear, the one insisting that intimacy will somehow consume or expose them, takes back control and they retreat once more. This illusion of sudden vulnerability represents their unconscious attempt to reclaim emotional stability by re-engaging the very dynamic that once protected them in the first place. It's a way of testing whether you still genuinely care, whether they still hold any emotional influence over you. Their tenderness becomes a tool in this process, not in any deliberately malicious sense, but as a method of self-soothing instead. They aren't consciously trying to deceive you. They're trying to reassure themselves that they're still seen, still remembered, still significant somewhere within your emotional world. It's tragic because the vulnerability they display in that moment is genuinely real while it's happening, but it's also fleeting, born from fear rather than any real personal growth. The truth is that their return was never really about reconciliation. It was about self-preservation. They want to feel that they still matter, that the bond you once shared hasn't completely died out entirely. This illusion of vulnerability becomes their final act of control, gentle, emotional, and genuinely disarming. It draws you back into the dynamic without you even fully realizing it's happening, making you question your own carefully built boundaries. But it isn't love calling them back to you. It's the terror of facing themselves without the mirror your care once reliably provided. When an avoidant person senses that they're no longer the center of your emotional world, they begin to feel a real loss of psychological safety setting in. Your withdrawal, your silence, your refusal to keep engaging in the same emotional pattern that once defined the connection, all of it threatens the fragile structure of their control. For a long time, they existed comfortably in the knowledge that no matter how distant they became, your care would remain steady and constant. You would reach out, explain yourself, forgive them, keep waiting. But when that energy finally fades away, when your attention no longer flows automatically in their direction, they begin feeling something deeply unsettling, a genuine loss of emotional dominance over the situation. In this exact moment, their final defense mechanism arises, subtle but genuinely powerful, the attempt to plant guilt, doubt, and nostalgia directly into your mind. This was never about reconciliation. It's about restoring the emotional imbalance that once kept them feeling safe from real intimacy. They begin pulling psychological strings designed to make you question whether you were too cold, too impatient, too unforgiving toward them. Their words might sound entirely innocent on the surface. I didn't expect you to move on so quickly. I thought what we had meant more than this. I just needed some time. Each statement gets carefully designed to stir something specific within you. Regret, second guessing, a lingering sense of responsibility for how everything unfolded between you. The avoidant person rarely confronts their own pattern of emotional avoidance directly. Instead, they shift the entire narrative so that you begin carrying the emotional weight of the separation yourself. Their goal was never to heal anything. It's to ensure you still feel tied to them somehow, even if that tie comes through guilt or confusion rather than genuine connection. Emotional detachment from you feels like outright rejection to them. But instead of admitting to that pain openly, they mask it by making you question your own role in the disconnection instead. This manipulation isn't always fully conscious on their part. It's a learned psychological defense, born from years of genuinely fearing vulnerability. By triggering guilt in you, the avoidant person can regain a sense of control without ever having to risk real exposure themselves. They understand, often quite intuitively, that if they can make you feel uncertain about your own boundaries, they can subtly pull you back into the emotional dynamic they once relied on. Guilt becomes their invisible tether in this process. It keeps you emotionally engaged even after the relationship itself no longer technically exists. They rely on your empathy, the very quality that originally drew you toward them, to maintain their significance inside your mind. The irony here is that the same sensitivity that once drew you to them becomes the exact tool they use to keep you from fully moving on. You might notice how they tend to reach out during moments of your peace rather than during moments of your pain. When you've finally started feeling some clarity, when you've begun genuinely accepting the loss, that's precisely when their message tends to arrive. It's rarely direct or confrontational in tone. It might come disguised as a shared memory. Do you remember that night when everything felt right between us? Or as a statement specifically designed to appeal to your compassion, I know I hurt you, but I was genuinely scared. These words get carefully crafted to reopen emotional doors you've worked so hard to close. They want to feel that they can still affect you emotionally, that they still hold some kind of emotional gravity within your world. It was never really the loss of love that hurts them the most. It's the loss of power that genuinely stings. This entire dynamic creates real confusion within you. Their sudden display of emotional awareness feels genuine, and in certain ways, it actually is genuine in the moment. But the underlying intention behind it isn't to rebuild anything meaningful. It's to re-establish control over the situation. The avoidant person cannot stand the feeling of being forgotten or replaced. Yet they also cannot tolerate full emotional intimacy either, so they oscillate back and forth between distance and re-engagement, using guilt and nostalgia as tools to keep you orbiting around their emotional world indefinitely. It becomes a quiet, sophisticated form of manipulation wrapped carefully in sentimentality. You begin questioning your own growth, your own right to detach, your own decision to finally let go. That's precisely the effect they're seeking, not genuine reconciliation, but reassurance that they still matter to you. By triggering your guilt, they also manage to silence their own guilt in the process. If they can make you doubt your own actions, they can avoid facing the truth of theirs entirely. They can convince themselves that both of you share equal responsibility for the distance that formed, that it wasn't solely their withdrawal or avoidance that caused the fracture in the first place. This shared sense of guilt soothes their conscience, allowing them to maintain emotional distance without ever having to confront the pain they actually caused. It's a defense mechanism that keeps them from having to see themselves clearly. The emotional fog they create becomes both a shield and a strange comfort for them. The avoidant person's final trick is genuinely subtle, almost invisible, because it plays directly on the very emotions that once defined your love for them: empathy, hope, compassion. They rely on your heart's natural tendency to understand rather than condemn, to forgive rather than abandon entirely. And so by awakening your guilt and doubt, they pull you back into the emotional maze, not to actually reunite with you, but simply to prevent you from truly walking away for good. When you finally detach from the avoidant person, when your heart no longer dances along to the rhythm of their inconsistency, something genuinely shifts in the energy between you two. For a long time, they were the ones holding all the control, the ones who dictated exactly when closeness was allowed and when distance became necessary instead. That constant push and pull was their comfort zone, their particular way of staying connected without ever feeling consumed by the relationship. But when you finally step back, when you no longer react to their silence, when your emotional world starts revolving around your own peace rather than their approval, the entire power dynamic between you reverses completely. The very control that once gave them a sense of safety begins slipping steadily through their fingers. The avoidant person's sense of power was never really about dominance in the external world. It's specifically emotional dominance. It lies in knowing they could pull away and still remain desired, that they could withhold affection and still be actively chased. Once that chase finally ends for good, they're left standing face to face with something they've spent their entire lives actively avoiding: genuine emotional vulnerability. In that particular space of reversal, they feel a deeply unfamiliar discomfort setting in. To them, your indifference doesn't just signal the end of affection between you, it feels like genuine exposure instead. Their detachment no longer gives them any real control, simply because it no longer provokes a reaction out of you. They begin realizing that their emotional strategies, silence, withdrawal, avoidance, no longer hold any real power over you anymore. This realization is genuinely terrifying for them because it directly challenges the internal system they've built over years to protect themselves from pain. Avoidants often use mixed signals and unpredictability to regain emotional control when your detachment attachment threatens their sense of safety. They may pull you close again with sudden tenderness, only to withdraw once more the moment they sense your openness returning. It's a cycle specifically designed to re-establish emotional dominance, to test whether your newfound peace can actually be broken. This power shift isn't just happening externally between you two. It's happening internally within them as well. Your detachment forces them to confront a mirror they've avoided looking into their entire lives. A mirror that shows them exactly who they are without someone else's emotional devotion to define them. Their old identity, the one built entirely on control, on emotional superiority, on being desired but never truly vulnerable, begins crumbling beneath them. And rather than face that internal collapse head-on, they try instead to recreate the exact dynamic that once kept them feeling safe. That is the true essence of their final, subtle trick, luring you back into the imbalance that feeds their fear, all while disguising it as genuine reconnection. They don't actually seek love's warmth. They seek the comfort of control instead. When you finally stop chasing the avoidant person, when your silence replaces your longing and your peace replaces your pleading, something genuinely profound happens beneath the surface of things. For the first time, the avoidant person no longer has a mirror available to project their identity onto. Your care, your patience, your emotional presence, all of it once served as a reflection that allowed them to avoid facing themselves honestly. Through you, they saw confirmation of their own worth, validation of their control, and an escape route from their deepest fear, the emptiness sitting within them. But when you withdraw completely, when that mirror finally goes dark, they're forced to confront exactly what they've been running from their entire lives. The silence they once used as armor begins echoing back at them, and in that echo they hear themselves clearly for what might be the first time. What was once comfortable distance transforms into unbearable emptiness instead. This is the exact moment when the avoidant person begins realizing that the very thing they were protecting themselves from, genuine intimacy, is also the thing they crave most deeply, while simultaneously fearing it most intensely. For a long time, the avoidant person built their entire sense of self around control. They found safety in emotional independence, genuinely believing that closeness meant vulnerability, and that vulnerability meant real danger. When you entered their life, you represented both desire and threat simultaneously. They wanted your warmth, but they feared the depth you brought with you. They loved your consistency, yet they resented how it revealed their own underlying instability. Your love became the mirror through which they could temporarily glimpse the parts of themselves they'd long suppressed, the parts that genuinely wanted to trust, to feel, to belong somewhere. But the more you cared for them, the more they recoiled from it, because your care illuminated exactly what they were trying so hard to hide. It exposed the child within them who never learned how to be loved safely in the first place. So they pushed you away, not out of any real cruelty, but out of genuine fear that your reflection would reveal their unhealed wounds to the world. Yet the moment you stop caring, when your light fades from their world entirely, that same reflection disappears along with it. Suddenly they no longer have a distraction from their own silence to hide behind. The emotional mirror is completely gone, and all that remains is the self they've spent years actively avoiding. At first, they might try filling that void with distractions, new people, work, routine, anything at all that helps them feel a sense of control again. But nothing genuinely replaces the mirror you once provided, because it was never really about the relationship itself. It was about the way your presence helped them escape from themselves. The loss of that reflection isn't merely emotional in nature, it's genuinely existential. It forces them to confront a truth they've been denying for years, that their avoidance of love is really an avoidance of self. This confrontation proves deeply unsettling for them. Without you there to reflect their image back, they begin feeling genuinely invisible. They may wonder why they suddenly feel lost or restless, why their usual defenses no longer bring them any real relief. This is exactly when their final trick emerges, the attempt to pull you back, not out of love, but out of sheer desperation to avoid that internal confrontation. They might reach out, reappear in your life, or act as though they've genuinely changed. But what they're really seeking is the restoration of that mirror they've lost. They need you to see them again, to make them feel real once more, to remind them of who they were back when you were still emotionally available to them. It isn't real intimacy they actually want. It's escape from the void they're now facing. They fear that without your reflection, they'll have to face their own emptiness directly, and they simply don't have the tools yet to do that. This mirror effect represents the hidden tragedy underlying avoidant behavior as a whole. They run from closeness because it threatens their fragile sense of self, but they also run back toward it the moment distance reveals their own loneliness. They're caught in an endless cycle of seeking and fleeing, never quite realizing that the peace they're actually searching for exists only within the very intimacy they keep rejecting. When you stop caring, you disrupt that entire cycle. You no longer serve as their emotional mirror, and in doing so, you force them to look inward for the first time. Some will resist this shift, trying to pull you back into their orbit specifically to avoid this reckoning with themselves. Others will retreat further into isolation, mistaking silence for genuine safety. But whether they realize it consciously or not, your detachment becomes the true mirror they actually needed all along. The one that reflects back not who they are through someone else's love, but who they've actually become in the absence of it. When you finally step back from the avoidant person for good, when your heart no longer bends itself around their distance, you do something they genuinely never expected. You show them a version of love that doesn't need to chase, fix, or constantly prove its own worth. In your silence, you hand them the mirror they've avoided their entire life. They begin seeing clearly what their control, their emotional games, and their fear have actually cost them. Their final trick, the guilt, the illusion of vulnerability, the pullback into chaos, was never born of cruelty. It was born of fear, fear of facing themselves without your reflection to lean on, fear of realizing that the love they once pushed away was the very thing that could have set them free. And in the end, your detachment becomes their lesson to learn. Because when you stop caring, when you choose peace over the cycle you were once trapped in, you don't just break the pattern between you, you expose it entirely. And in that quiet revelation, the avoidant person is left facing the one truth they can no longer escape from. The distance was never really between you and them. It was always between them and themselves.